Detective Thomas Keller built his career on tough policing and unquestioned authority, but when he accuses and assaults Eliza Moore, an elderly black woman, his life begins to unravel. What should have been a routine arrest turns into a nightmare as Eliza's true identity and her connections to powerful political figures are revealed. As an internal investigation opens a Pandora's box of corruption buried within the police department, Thomas faces an impossible choice: protect his career and legacy, or expose the truth, even if it means destroying everything he knows, including his own family. But Eliza holds a secret that will not only shatter the department, but will force Thomas to confront a haunting past that could change his life forever. In this powerful tale of redemption, guilt, and the cost of justice, Beneath the Badge delves deep into the human soul, asking the question, how far will you go to make things right when the truth threatens to destroy you? Detective Thomas Keller has spent decades climbing the ranks of the police force, but his success has come at a cost. Known for his hardline, often racially biased approach to policing, Thomas is feared by the community and respected, albeit reluctantly, by his peers. But one mistake will unravel everything. When Thomas accuses Eliza Moore, an elderly black woman, of theft and violently assaults her, he believes it's just another case in a long line of unquestioned authority. However, Eliza is not who she appears to be. What should have been a simple incident ignites a firestorm of controversy when the truth about Eliza's identity is revealed. She is a prominent figure with deep ties to political elites and the fight for civil rights, and her connections could destroy not only Thomas's career but the entire police department. As the department launches an internal investigation, they stumble upon a web of corruption and buried secrets that trace back decades, and Eliza holds the key to it all. Thomas is torn between covering up the truth to save himself or exposing the darkness within his own ranks, even if it means confronting the devastating truth about his family's past. Caught in the crossfire of guilt, shame, and the pursuit of justice, Thomas must decide if he's willing to risk everything to right his wrongs. But the deeper he digs, the more he realizes that Eliza knows more about him than he ever imagined. In a shocking twist, Thomas is forced to face a haunting connection between them, one that will change the course of his life forever. Mid-40s, rugged, with salt and pepper hair that is always neatly combed. His chiseled face shows years of hard living, and his cold blue eyes reveal little emotion. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moves with the confidence of someone used to being in control. Thomas grew up in a small, predominantly white town where his father was also a police officer. Raised with a strict sense of duty, he followed in his father's footsteps but adopted his prejudices as well. Rising through the ranks, Thomas became known for his no-nonsense policing, often targeting minority communities. Despite his success, his strained relationship with his family and the ghosts of his past haunt him, especially his connection to the corrupt side of the force that he has long ignored. In her early 70s, Eliza is petite but carries herself with an air of dignity and wisdom. Her silver hair is usually worn in a neat bun, and her dark brown eyes are sharp, missing nothing. She has soft, weathered skin, showing the signs of a hard life filled with battles. Eliza has been a quiet but influential figure in the local community for decades, though few know the full extent of her past. She grew up during the civil rights era and was heavily involved in the movement, working behind the scenes with powerful leaders. Her connections to political figures and her role in uncovering past injustices have kept her at the edge of powerful circles. Eliza is hiding a deep, dark secret related to the corruption in the police force, and her encounter with Thomas is no coincidence. In his 50s, Marcus is a well-built man with a square jaw and thinning brown hair. His face is marked with stress lines, and his deep-set brown eyes give away years of frustration and fatigue. Marcus is the police captain and has been friends with Thomas for years, but their relationship has grown strained. He's aware of the systemic issues within the department, but has struggled to navigate the fine line between protecting his officers and facing the corruption. Marcus has a deeper connection to Eliza than Thomas realizes, and it's something he has buried for years. The investigation into Eliza's case forces Marcus to reckon with the truth he's avoided. In her early 40s, Sarah is slim with wavy blonde hair that falls just past her shoulders. Her green eyes, once full of life, now seem tired, reflecting the strain of her marriage. She often dresses modestly, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in her chaotic life. Sarah married Thomas in her early 20s, thinking she was getting the strong, dependable man she admired. Over the years, his emotional distance and growing bitterness have taken a toll on her. She has become increasingly aware of his racial prejudices and the cracks in his morality. With their marriage on the brink, she quietly considers her own escape, especially when the scandal with Eliza surfaces. In her 30s, Maya is tall and athletic. With curly black hair she keeps pulled back in a ponytail. Her skin is a rich brown, and her hazel eyes are always sharp, searching for the truth. Her confident demeanor commands respect. Backstory: Maya is one of the few black detectives in the department and has faced her share of discrimination from both her colleagues and the public. She grew up in the same community as Eliza and has long admired her work, though they are not personally close. Maya becomes the lead investigator in Eliza's case and sees this as an opportunity to expose the department's corruption. She is driven by a sense of justice, but finds herself torn between her ambition and the personal stakes involved. A two-story brick building in the center of town, the station is both a symbol of authority and a place weighed down by the secrets it holds. The inside is stark, with pale walls, cluttered desks, and a faint smell of coffee and sweat. The station houses not only the officers but also the evidence room, which holds the remnants of unsolved cases and dark truths. Eliza lives in a modest, well-kept house on the outskirts of town. The exterior is plain, with faded white paint and a small garden out front, but inside, the house is filled with mementos from her long life, photos, books, and relics of the civil rights movement. The home exudes warmth and history, hiding a deeper connection to the town's past. A dim, musty basement located beneath the police station, the archives contain decades' worth of case files and evidence, including the skeletons of the town's corrupt past. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows, making it a place few officers visit unless necessary. It becomes a key location in the investigation. The captain's office is a cramped room in the police station, with a large desk cluttered with papers, old case files, and a few framed photos of Marcus's family. It's a place where Marcus often finds himself staring out the window, reflecting on the growing cracks in his department and his own complicity. Located in the heart of the black neighborhood, the community center is where Eliza once led meetings and organized events during her activism days. Now, it serves as a hub for social justice work and a safe space for the local community. It's a stark contrast to the sterile, oppressive atmosphere of the police station. The confrontation: Thomas wrongfully accuses and arrests Eliza Moore. The arrest: Eliza's calm demeanor unsettles Thomas as they drive to the station. Back at the station, Marcus Brennan intervenes, concerned about the potential backlash. The reveal: Eliza's powerful connections are uncovered, shocking the department. Eliza's departure: Eliza warns Thomas, setting up his growing paranoia. Oak Ridge Police Station conference room. The footage of Thomas's confrontation with Eliza goes viral, leading to an internal investigation by the police department to contain the situation. Captain Marcus calls an emergency meeting to discuss damage control. Tensions run high as Thomas faces criticism from his peers and higher-ups, who fear the political fallout. Thomas feels increasingly isolated, realizing that his actions may cost him his career. Marcus pressures him to stay quiet until they can resolve the issue, sowing further distrust. Marcus Brennan's office. Marcus begins his own investigation into Eliza's background after realizing her potential influence. He goes through old case files and contacts people from Eliza's past. He uncovers her involvement in exposing past corruption in the city, a discovery that shakes him, as he suspects Eliza knows more than she's letting on. Marcus begins to fear that Eliza's influence could bring to light long-buried secrets that could destroy him and the department. Thomas's home. Evening. Thomas, rattled by the ongoing investigation, starts questioning his own moral code. At home, his wife Sarah tries to comfort him, but their strained relationship makes it difficult. Thomas feels guilty about the incident, but he can't admit it aloud. His growing fear of the consequences weighs on him. This scene deepens Thomas's internal conflict, showing that his fear and guilt are starting to eat away at him. Thomas's driveway. Late night. Thomas is alone when a black car pulls up outside his house. A man steps out of the car and hands him a sealed envelope, warning him that it's not over. Inside is a cryptic note with a single sentence. Do you know what she knows? The identity of the sender is unclear, but it further fuels Thomas's paranoia. This mysterious message hints at a deeper conspiracy and pushes Thomas to start investigating Eliza on his own. The local library's archive section. Driven by the cryptic note, Thomas begins digging into Eliza's past, hoping to understand what she knows. Thomas uncovers old newspaper articles and records detailing Eliza's involvement in the civil rights movement and her role in uncovering police corruption decades ago. The deeper he digs, the more he realizes that her influence is far-reaching. Thomas realizes that Eliza isn't just a random victim. She's someone who could ruin his career and the department. His fear of exposure intensifies. Marcus's office, morning. Thomas, increasingly desperate, confronts Marcus about what he's discovered. He accuses Marcus of hiding something about Eliza. Marcus denies knowing the full extent of her influence, but warns Thomas to stop digging before things spiral out of control. Marcus's evasiveness plants seeds of suspicion in Thomas. Thomas begins to distrust Marcus, feeling that his captain may be hiding something bigger. Thomas's home, evening. While Thomas is away, Sarah stumbles upon some of the documents he's collected on Eliza. Curious, she digs through the files and is shocked to find a connection between Eliza and Thomas's own family, something Thomas hasn't yet discovered. Sarah's discovery raises the stakes, hinting at a personal connection between Eliza and Thomas, which could unravel their lives. Eliza's home night. Thomas, frustrated and scared, shows up at Eliza's house, demanding answers. Eliza remains calm, once again warning him that his actions have set something much larger in motion. She hints that there are more people involved, and that Thomas has only scratched the surface of a long-standing conspiracy. Thomas leaves feeling even more unsettled, realizing that Eliza is far more dangerous than he initially thought. Thomas's childhood home. Following Sarah's discovery, Thomas begins to piece together his own family's role in the corruption that Eliza exposed. Thomas visits his estranged brother, who reveals that their father, a former police officer, was involved in covering up a major crime tied to Eliza's past. This revelation shakes Thomas to his core, forcing him to confront the reality that his own family is implicated in the dark history he's uncovering. A secluded park, early morning. Thomas pressures Marcus to tell him the truth about Eliza and the department's involvement in the old corruption cases. Marcus, cornered, admits that he's known about Eliza's influence for years, but chose to look the other way to protect the department. He warns Thomas that exposing the truth could destroy both of their careers. Thomas is torn between loyalty to the force and his growing desire to do the right thing. Eliza's home, afternoon. Desperate for answers, Thomas confronts Eliza one last time, demanding to know her connection to his father. Eliza reveals that she knew his father well, and that he was involved in the cover-up of a racially motivated crime that changed her life. She explains that Thomas's father wasn't the man he thought he was. This revelation brings the story to a critical turning point, as Thomas realizes that his entire life has been built on lies. Oak Ridge Police Station, morning. Rumors about the investigation and the department's dark past begin to spread, and the public demands answers. The police department is thrown into chaos as the media begins to expose the old corruption cases. Marcus is under immense pressure, and Thomas is implicated in the scandal. The department is on the verge of collapse, and Thomas realizes that he must act before everything falls apart. Thomas's home, night. After a sleepless night of reflection, Thomas comes to a decision. He decides to come forward with everything he's learned, regardless of the personal and professional cost. He confides in Sarah, who supports his decision, knowing it's the only way they can move forward. Thomas's decision sets up the final act of the story, where he will confront the truth and face the consequences of his actions. A public press conference, midday. Thomas and Marcus are called to a press conference to address the scandal. In front of the media and the public, Thomas reveals everything he has learned about the department's corruption and his father's involvement. He admits his own mistakes and apologizes to Eliza. The confession shocks the town and sets off a chain of events that leads to a full-scale investigation of the police force. Oak Ridge Police Station, 1 week later. The department is in shambles as investigations into the corruption cases move forward. Scene: Marcus resigns in disgrace, and Thomas is suspended, awaiting the results of the investigation. The public is divided. Some see him as a hero for coming forward, while others view him as a traitor to the force. Thomas faces the consequences of his actions, both good and bad. Eliza's home, evening. Thomas visits Eliza to apologize personally. In a quiet, emotional moment, Eliza forgives Thomas, acknowledging the courage it took for him to come forward. She reveals that she knew all along that Thomas would eventually uncover the truth and make the right choice. This moment provides emotional closure for both characters, symbolizing redemption and the possibility of change. Thomas's home, late night. With the department in turmoil, Thomas faces an uncertain future. Thomas reflects on everything that has happened and decides that, even if he never returns to the force, he will work to make amends for his past. He and Sarah begin to rebuild their fractured relationship. The story closes on a note of redemption and hope, with Thomas choosing a new path for himself, one based on truth and justice. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot of Walker's grocery store. Detective Thomas Keller pulled up in his squad car, the tires crunching over gravel. His day had already been a long one: 2 calls about petty theft, a noise complaint from a belligerent neighbor, and a domestic dispute that had ended in a shouting match, leaving him on edge. The last thing he wanted was to deal with another minor incident. As he stepped out of the car, he spotted the suspect immediately: an elderly black woman, small in stature, standing calmly by the store entrance. She was holding a simple canvas bag, her posture straight, her face expressionless. He knew the look. He had seen it before in people who thought they could get away with something. Thomas approached her, his hand already resting on his belt. "Eliza Moore," he barked, not waiting for a response. "You've been accused of theft. Empty your bag." Eliza didn't flinch. Her eyes met his without fear, steady and calm. "I haven't stolen anything." Her words grated on him, the quiet defiance stoking his anger. He was used to people cowering when confronted, not standing their ground. "Empty the bag," he repeated, his voice harsher this time. Still, Eliza didn't move. "I've done nothing wrong," she said softly. The crowd began to gather, murmurs spreading through the air like wildfire. A young woman pulled out her phone, recording the scene. Thomas could feel the pressure building in his chest, the simmering frustration of a long day boiling over. Without warning, he grabbed Eliza's arm and twisted it behind her back, forcing her against the brick wall of the grocery store. The crowd gasped, and the phone camera zoomed in. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" he hissed, tightening the grip on her wrist. "You're under arrest for theft." Eliza winced but didn't cry out. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding in his ears. Thomas shoved her into the squad car, slamming the door. "I don't care who you are." The ride back to the station was silent. Eliza sat in the back, her posture still as upright as when he had first seen her. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, the weight of her gaze in the rearview mirror gnawing at him. Her presence unnerved him, though he couldn't explain why. There was something about the way she had spoken, calm, almost resigned, as if she had been expecting this. "You made a big mistake today," she said softly, her voice carrying effortlessly through the car. "You'll regret this." Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter, refusing to engage. She was trying to rattle him, he told himself. That's what criminals did. They tried to get under your skin, make you doubt yourself. But he was in the right. He was just doing his job. "Do you even know who I am?" Eliza asked, her voice gentle yet pointed. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his stomach twisting slightly. "Doesn't matter who you are," he muttered. "It will," she replied. "Soon enough." The rest of the drive was silent, but her words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. The Oak Ridge police station was bustling when they arrived. Thomas walked Eliza through the front doors, his grip firm but not aggressive. As they entered, heads turned. Word had already spread about the incident, and people were talking. Detective Maya Harris, one of the few black officers on the force, shot Thomas a hard look, but said nothing. Captain Marcus Brennan was waiting in the interrogation room, his arms crossed and his face grim. "What the hell happened out there, Thomas?" he demanded as soon as the door closed behind them. Thomas dropped into the chair across from Marcus, feeling the exhaustion of the day finally weighing him down. "Petty theft call," he said. "She resisted." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Resisted? An old woman like that?" Thomas bristled. "She wouldn't cooperate." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know the town's on edge. Racial tensions are already high. You couldn't have handled this more carefully?" "I did what I had to," Thomas shot back. "She was breaking the law." A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. A young officer stepped in, a file in his hand. "Captain," he said nervously, "you might want to see this." Marcus took the file, flipping it open. His expression changed instantly. His face paled, and his eyes widened slightly. He closed the file, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Release her," he said quietly. Thomas blinked. "What?" "Release her," Marcus repeated, his voice firm. "Now." "What the hell is going on?" Thomas demanded, but Marcus was already out the door, the file clutched tightly in his hand. Thomas followed Marcus out into the hallway, his heart pounding. "What's going on?" he pressed, his voice low but urgent. Marcus stopped, turning to face him. "Do you know who she is?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's Eliza Moore. She's connected, deeply connected. Civil rights leader, worked with half the political elites in this state. She could ruin us." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "That can't be." "She's got connections, Thomas," Marcus interrupted. "Powerful connections. This isn't some random arrest. This is a powder keg waiting to explode." For the first time that day, Thomas felt the sting of fear. He had assumed Eliza was just another petty criminal, but now he realized he had stepped into something much larger than he had anticipated. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. Marcus looked at him, his expression grave. "We hope she doesn't come after us." Thomas stood outside the station as Eliza was escorted out, her calm demeanor unshaken despite the day's events. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, opening the door for her. Before she climbed in, Eliza turned to face Thomas, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't know what you've started," she said softly, the words hanging in the air like a threat or a promise. Thomas watched her drive away, his heart pounding in his chest. The crowd outside the station was still buzzing, the phone cameras still rolling. He had lost control of the situation, and now he was left to deal with the consequences. As the car disappeared down the street, Thomas felt the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. The investigation was just beginning, and he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went, or how far it would drag him down. The Oak Ridge Police Station conference room was filled with an uneasy tension. The harsh overhead lights reflected off the tired, strained faces of the officers gathered around the long table. Captain Marcus Brennan stood at the head of the room, arms crossed, his jaw set in a hard line. Thomas sat near the corner, his leg bouncing anxiously under the table. He could feel eyes on him, whispers barely contained. The video of his confrontation with Eliza had spread like wildfire. What he had hoped would be a routine arrest had turned into a public relations nightmare. Phones had been out, cameras recording every second of the incident, and now it was all over social media, the footage distorted by shaky hands, but clear enough to show his aggression toward an elderly woman. "We've got a serious situation on our hands," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but authoritative, and there was no mistaking the urgency behind it. "We're facing backlash from the community. The press is all over it, and City Hall is breathing down my neck. This is not going to go away on its own." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the gazes of his colleagues. He felt the weight of their judgment, even if none of them had the guts to say it out loud. They were all thinking the same thing. He had messed up, and now they were all going to pay for it. "We've opened an internal investigation," Marcus continued, his eyes scanning the room, "and the public relations team is doing their best to manage the fallout. But we need to be prepared for this to escalate. This is bigger than any of us thought." Thomas felt his stomach churn. He had never liked being the center of attention, especially when it was for something like this. He had made arrests like Eliza's dozens of times before. Why was this one different? Why was the world suddenly watching? Marcus turned his gaze to Thomas, his expression unreadable. We're going to keep this internal for now. Thomas, you'll need to lay low until we figure out how to handle this. Lay low? Thomas's voice came out harsher than he intended. I didn't do anything wrong. I followed procedure. Procedure doesn't matter if public perception turns against us, Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp. Right now, we're not just dealing with a legal issue. This is political. And like it or not, we're all going to have to play it smart. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the steely look in Marcus's eyes. There was no point in fighting this, not now. The room fell into silence once more, and Thomas's thoughts swirled. He knew he wasn't out of the woods yet. Far from it. Later that day, Marcus sat in his cramped office, the blinds half closed, casting thin slats of light across the cluttered desk. He stared down at a stack of files, all stamped with the familiar red letters. Confidential. Each file was a thread in the tangled web of Oak Ridge's history, a history that Eliza Moore seemed to be intimately connected to. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Eliza Moore wasn't just any elderly woman. She was a figure that loomed large in the town's shadows, a name spoken with both reverence and fear in certain circles. She had been active in the civil rights movement, a key figure behind the scenes who had worked tirelessly to expose the systemic corruption within the city's power structure. And now, here she was again, caught in a scandal that threatened to unravel everything. He picked up the phone, dialing an old contact, someone who had worked with Eliza in her early days, back when her fight for justice had been quieter but no less dangerous. What do you know about her? Marcus asked when the gruff voice answered on the other end. Eliza Moore. What's her connection to Oak Ridge? The voice on the other line paused, then spoke carefully. She knows a lot more than she lets on. You should be careful. She's been pulling strings behind the scenes for decades, exposing corruption where she finds it. If she's involved, it's because she's after something. Marcus hung up the phone, a pit forming in his stomach. Eliza's involvement in the civil rights movement wasn't just history. It was a ticking time bomb that could blow up in all of their faces. And if she was after something, he had no doubt that she would get it. He leaned forward, rubbing his temples. This was no ordinary case. And now, they were all caught in it. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness of the house. His wife, Sarah, moved quietly around the kitchen, the tension between them palpable. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him, not meeting his eyes as she sat down across from him. He stared into the black liquid, his mind racing. The events of the past few days had left him feeling hollow. The confrontation with Eliza, the public backlash, the internal investigation. It was all unraveling faster than he could control. And now, the guilt was starting to creep in, gnawing at him in ways he hadn't expected. Thomas, Sarah said softly, her voice tentative, what's really going on? He looked up at her, his face hard. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. I don't know, he admitted. I thought I was just doing my job. I didn't think it would turn into this. Sarah reached out, her hand covering his. You've been on edge for a long time, she said. This isn't just about Eliza Moore. Something's been bothering you for months. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled his hand away and stood up, pacing across the room. He could feel the guilt building, pressing down on his chest. But he didn't know how to talk about it, didn't know how to admit that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. Sarah watched him, her face etched with concern. Thomas, she said quietly, you don't have to carry this alone. He stopped, his back to her, the weight of her words heavy in the air. He knew she was right, but admitting it felt like a betrayal of everything he had built his career on. He was a cop, a protector, someone who followed the rules. But now, those rules felt like they were crumbling beneath him. Without a word, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah alone at the table. The night was quiet as Thomas sat on his front porch, the darkness surrounding him like a blanket. The stars were barely visible, hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside him, but it was no use. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eliza's calm, unflinching face, her words echoing in his mind. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness, a sleek black car pulling up to the curb in front of his house. Thomas narrowed his eyes, standing up as the car door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. "Detective Keller," the man said, his voice low and smooth. "I have something for you." Thomas tensed as the man approached, holding out a sealed envelope. "What is this?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. The man smiled, a thin, unsettling smile. "Just a message. You'll understand when you open it." Without another word, the man turned and walked back to the car, leaving Thomas standing there, the envelope heavy in his hand. The car sped off into the night, leaving behind nothing but the sound of its tires on the pavement. Thomas tore open the envelope, his heart racing. Inside was a single piece of paper with one sentence scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. "Do you know what she knows?" He stared at the note, his mind spinning. Who had sent this? What did it mean? And more importantly, what did Eliza Moore know that he didn't? The question lingered in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. The local library was nearly empty as Detective Thomas Keller entered, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The smell of dust and old paper filled the air, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos he had just left behind at the police station. He made his way toward the archive section, a dark corner of the building that held decades' worth of records, newspaper clippings, court transcripts, and town histories. Thomas's mind was still reeling from the cryptic note left in his mailbox the night before. "Do you know what she knows?" It had unnerved him more than he cared to admit, but it also fueled his determination. Whoever had sent it clearly knew something about Eliza Moore, and now he was going to find out exactly what that was. The librarian led him to a small room lined with shelves of yellowing files and dusty books. She left him alone, and Thomas wasted no time, pulling down anything that might give him a clue about Eliza's past. He began skimming through the records, his eyes scanning quickly over old headlines. Civil rights activist speaks out against Oak Ridge police corruption. Local leader Eliza Moore exposes decades of racial injustice. His heart began to race. Eliza hadn't just been a quiet member of the community. She had been a driving force in uncovering the town's deepest, darkest secrets. And the more Thomas read, the more he realized just how deeply Eliza was embedded in Oak Ridge's history. He found an article dated from the 1980s. Police officer implicated in scandal, forced to resign following Moore's investigation. The name of the officer was blacked out, but the implications were clear. Eliza had taken down corrupt police officers before. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. This was no coincidence. Eliza wasn't a random woman who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had a history of exposing corruption within the force, and now he was certain that she was back for a reason. He knew now that Eliza wasn't just a victim. She was someone who could bring down everything. The next morning, Thomas stood outside Captain Marcus Brennan's office, his heart pounding. He had spent the night piecing together everything he had learned about Eliza, and it was clear that Marcus had been hiding something. The time for tiptoeing around the truth was over. He knocked once and entered before Marcus could respond. The captain was seated at his desk, papers scattered around him. He looked up, surprised but not entirely caught off guard. "Thomas," Marcus said slowly, "what brings you here this early?" Thomas didn't waste time. He placed a folder full of clippings and documents on the desk in front of Marcus. "You've been keeping something from me," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Eliza Moore isn't just some random old woman. She's been exposing corruption in this town for decades, and I think you knew that." Marcus's expression darkened, but he didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the folder. "What are you trying to say, Thomas?" "I'm saying you knew who she was when I arrested her," Thomas pressed. "You knew that her involvement would bring trouble, and yet you didn't tell me. Why?" Marcus sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not that simple," he finally said, his voice weary. "Eliza has connections, and yes, I've known about her work for a long time. But this, he gestured to the folder, isn't just about you or me. It's about the entire department. If you keep digging into this, you're going to uncover things that neither of us are ready to face. Thomas's jaw tightened. What do you mean? Marcus met his gaze, his eyes hard. There are skeletons in this town, Thomas. Skeletons that go all the way back to before you and I were even on the force. Eliza knows about them, and if she decides to start talking, it's going to tear this place apart. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas could feel the weight of Marcus's words settling over him, the enormity of the situation finally hitting him. This wasn't just about Eliza. This was about something much bigger, something that could destroy everything. That evening, Thomas returned home, his mind still reeling from his conversation with Marcus. He barely noticed his wife, Sarah, moving quietly around the house, lost in her own thoughts. It wasn't until he sat down at the kitchen table and noticed a stack of papers out of place that he realized something was wrong. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaky, "I found these while I was cleaning." She handed him a few crumpled documents, ones he hadn't seen before. His eyes scanned over the text, his breath catching as he realized what he was looking at. Eliza Moore linked to old Keller family case. "What is this?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her hands trembling slightly. "I was going through some old things, and I found that. It's about your family, Thomas. Your father." Thomas's heart dropped. His father, a police officer in Oak Ridge, had always been a looming figure in his life. But they had never been close. His father had died when Thomas was young, leaving behind more questions than answers. And now, it seemed, those answers were surfacing, answers he hadn't been prepared for. As he flipped through the documents, a horrifying realization began to take shape. His father had been involved in one of Eliza's early investigations, a case that had been covered up for decades. Eliza hadn't just stumbled into his life. She had been circling it for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. The room seemed to close in around him as the weight of the truth bore down on him. This was bigger than he had imagined, much bigger. Driven by a mixture of fear and desperation, Thomas found himself outside Eliza's modest home late that night. The house was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp near the front window. He had to know the truth. He had to understand what role his family had played in this tangled web of corruption. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Eliza stood there, her face calm but unreadable. "Detective Keller," she said softly, "I wondered when you would come." Thomas stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small living room. It was filled with mementos, photos, books, relics of a life spent fighting for justice. He turned to face her, his expression hard. "You've been digging into my family's past," he said, his voice tight. "Why?" Eliza didn't flinch. "I didn't dig, detective. Your family was already buried deep in the dirt. I simply uncovered what was hidden." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. "Why now?" Eliza sighed, folding her hands in front of her. "Your father was involved in something terrible, Thomas, something that was covered up for far too long. I've spent my life fighting to expose the truth, and now, the time has come for you to face it. This isn't just about you, detective. This is about justice." Thomas stared at her, the enormity of her words sinking in. His father, a man he had idolized for so long, was part of the corruption Eliza had been fighting against. And now, she was forcing him to confront that truth. "You can't stop this, Thomas," Eliza said softly. "What's been set in motion cannot be undone. You have to decide where you stand." Her words hung in the air, a chilling warning that cut deep into his soul. As Thomas left Eliza's house that night, he realized that everything he thought he knew was a lie. His father's legacy, the department he had dedicated his life to, all of it was built on a foundation of corruption and secrets. And now, there was no turning back. Thomas sat in his car, parked in front of his childhood home, staring at the weathered wooden door. The memories of this place felt distant, like watching an old film reel of someone else's life. He hadn't been back here in years, not since his father's funeral. Yet, here he was, drawn back by the whispers of corruption and betrayal that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching over the gravel driveway. The door opened before he even knocked, revealing his estranged brother, Daniel. He looked just as Thomas remembered him. Taller, leaner, with the same sharp blue eyes that had always seen more than they let on. "Thomas," Daniel said, his voice laced with surprise and wariness. "I didn't expect to see you." "I need answers," Thomas replied, cutting straight to the point. There was no time for pleasantries. He pushed past his brother into the house, the familiar smell of old wood and dust filling his senses. Daniel shut the door and followed him into the living room. "Answers to what?" he asked, but Thomas could tell from the tone of his voice that Daniel already knew. "Our father," Thomas said, pacing the length of the room. "He was involved in something, wasn't he? Something that Eliza Moore uncovered years ago. I need to know the truth." Daniel sighed heavily, sinking into the worn armchair that had once been their father's favorite spot. He rubbed his temples, as if the weight of the past was pressing down on him. "I hoped you'd never have to know," he said quietly, "but I guess it was only a matter of time." "What did he do?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising with frustration. Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Dad was involved in a cover-up. It was a racially motivated crime. Back in the 70s, a black family was driven out of town. Their home burned down. There were rumors it was orchestrated by members of the police force, and Eliza was trying to expose it. Dad, he helped bury the truth." Thomas felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. His father, a man he had idolized, a man he had followed into the same career, had been part of something so dark, so hateful. He had known his father wasn't perfect, but this? "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. "Because you were already walking in his footsteps," Daniel replied. "You had become just like him, and I didn't want to be the one to break that image for you." Thomas stood there, the weight of his brother's words crushing him. His father wasn't the man he thought he was. And now, he was beginning to wonder if he ever really knew himself. Early the next morning, Thomas sat on a park bench, waiting. The air was cool, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. He had asked Marcus to meet him here, away from the station, away from prying eyes. There was too much at stake to risk anyone overhearing their conversation. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, his face lined with exhaustion. He sat down next to Thomas, neither of them speaking for a long moment. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unsaid truths that had been building for weeks. "I know about my father," Thomas finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know what he did, and I think you do too." Marcus didn't look at him, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. "I've known for a long time," he admitted. "Your father was a good man in many ways, but he made choices that haunt this department to this day. He wasn't the only one involved, Thomas. There were others. The cover-up was systematic." Thomas clenched his fists, the anger and betrayal simmering just beneath the surface. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, his voice filled with hurt. Marcus turned to him, his expression weary. "Because I wanted to protect you. I've been trying to hold this department together for years. I knew if you found out the truth, it would destroy you, and maybe the department too. So you chose to lie?" Thomas shot back, his anger flaring. "You chose to protect the force over the truth?" "I didn't have a choice," Marcus said, his voice low. "Eliza Moore has been a thorn in our side for decades. She's been trying to bring all of this to light for years, and I've been doing my best to contain it. But now, it's out of my hands." Thomas stared at him, the realization sinking in. "You've been covering this up too," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. Marcus didn't deny it. "I've done what I thought was necessary to keep this department functioning, but I'm starting to realize that maybe I was wrong." Thomas stood up, his body tense with anger. "This isn't just about the department, Marcus. This is about people's lives. You've been protecting criminals, my father included, and now, it's all coming back to haunt us." Marcus stood too, his face etched with regret. "You're right," he said softly, But you need to understand, Thomas. If this comes out, it's going to destroy everything. Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. All he knew was that the man he had trusted, the man he had worked alongside for years, had been part of the very corruption he was trying to fight. That afternoon, Thomas found himself standing in front of Eliza's home once again. He knocked on the door, his mind racing with the revelations of the past few days. He needed answers, answers only she could give him. Eliza opened the door, her expression calm as always. "Detective Keller," she said, her voice steady. "I was expecting you." Thomas followed her inside, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't waste time with small talk. "You knew my father," he said, his voice strained. "You knew about the cover-up. Why didn't you tell me?" Eliza sat down in her armchair, her eyes sharp as they met his. "I didn't tell you because it wasn't my place," she replied. "The truth about your father had to come from you, not from me." Thomas stared at her, his emotions swirling. "He was part of that crime," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He helped cover it up." "Yes," Eliza said simply. "He did." Thomas sank into the chair across from her, his head in his hands. "Why now?" he asked, his voice filled with anguish. "Why did this have to come out now?" Eliza looked at him, her gaze softening. "Because the truth has a way of revealing itself when it's needed most," she said. "Your father wasn't the man you thought he was, but you are not him, Thomas. You have the chance to do what he couldn't, make things right." Thomas lifted his head, his eyes filled with pain. "How do I do that?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do I undo what he did?" Eliza leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "By choosing justice over loyalty. By doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." Thomas felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. His entire life had been built on a foundation of lies, but now he had the power to change the narrative. It wouldn't be easy. It would cost him everything he had worked for, but it was the only way forward. He stood up, his mind made up. "I'll do it," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll bring the truth to light." Eliza nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "I know you will." As Thomas left Eliza's home, he felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. The past was painful, filled with betrayal and corruption. But the future, his future, was now in his hands, and he was ready to face it, no matter the cost.